Hello, everybody. I'm Adam Scher, Vice President for Collections and Exhibitions at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and welcome back to another special at-home edition of our Banner Lecture Series. As you all probably know, the museum is closed for now, but we're still here for you to enrich your life by preserving and sharing the story of Virginia. If you haven't already seen what we have to offer, go online to virginiahistory.org/at-home, where you can enjoy a curated selection of free digital resources, including podcasts, webinars, virtual tours, and hours of recorded lectures. Of course, none of the work that we're doing right now could be possible without the generous support of our members. Unlike our neighboring museums, we don't receive state operating support, and it's through private donations that we're able to preserve and share Virginia's story and offer high quality programs like this. So thank you very much. Before I introduce our speaker, just a reminder that you can be part of today's conversation by asking a question on Facebook or YouTube, provided that you're logged in. And now for today's speaker, Mark Lender holds a PhD in American history from Rutgers University. He is Professor Emeritus of History at Kean University in Union, New Jersey, from which he retired as Vice President for Academic Affairs in 2011. He's the author or co-author of 11 books. His book, Fatal Sunday, George Washington, the Monmouth Campaign, and the Politics of Battle, won the Society for Military History's Distinguished Book of the Year Award in 2017. His latest book, and the subject for his talk today, is Cabal, the Plot Against General Washington. Please welcome Mark Lender.
Thank you, Mr. Scher. I do appreciate it, and my thanks as well to the museum for the invitation to speak at the Banner Lecture. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I want to begin with a letter. And I didn't need these just a year ago, but I need them now. It was in May of 1778 when the Valley Forge winter was essentially passing, the crisis was ending. Washington had a few spare moments to write to an old friend, Landon Carter, in Virginia. They were both members of the Virginia social elite. Washington could talk to him about things that he would not have to lesser acquaintances. It was sort of an unburdening. It was a long letter on who was doing what, private affairs. But then he hit on a less pleasant subject, which he again felt he could confide to an old friend. Let me read from his letter of May 1778 to Landon Carter. That there was a scheme to see me superseded in my command admits of no doubt. Now, Washington didn't mention names. It's quite clear from the context of the letter that those involved in the scheme, as he put it, were Major Generals Horatio Gates, the victor at Saratoga, and Major General Thomas Mifflin and Major General Thomas Conway. And when the plot that Washington feared became public, I'll continue reading from the letter. The plotters slunk back, disavowed the measure, and professed themselves my warmest admirers. Now, this is as blunt a statement we have from Washington on his belief in what historians ever since have called the Conway Cabal. And that will be my subject this afternoon. Conway Cabal has had an interesting time with historians. Early historians absolutely believed that the threat to Washington's command was real. But in 1940, a very fine scholar, Bernard Nolenberg, wrote a book called Washington and the Revolution, in which he concluded that while the critics of Washington were annoying, they did not actually constitute a major threat to his command. Among academic historians, that has been generally the prevailing, not universally, but generally the prevailing view down to the present time. I became interested in it in writing a previous book. Adam Scher mentioned Fatal Sunday. In that, I looked with a co-author at some of the critics of Washington And ever since that, it sort of nagged at me that there was more to this than I think most historians have understood. Led to another book called Cabal, The Plot Against General Washington, and I'm going to argue this afternoon that the plot against Washington was indeed quite real. Just a matter of carping critics who were annoying Washington while he was trying to save the army at Valley Forge, but not necessarily a political plot per se, but an effort by various sectors in and out of Congress, but with a lot of congressional support, to wear away the command authority of Washington as commander in chief and, in effect, take command of the war effort from his hands. It was, as much as anything, an administrative coup that had a great deal of congressional support. Now, to make this argument, we've got to look at who Washington's critics were and what their motives were, and why did they have, or why did they share the extent of disappointment in Washington's command that they did. Now, if you give me just 1 second, I'm going to get a PowerPoint presentation up, and we'll talk our way through this. And I hope you can all see that. One of the chief problems that Washington had, of course, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, was that his record in 1777 was not impressive. His campaign to hold Philadelphia had failed. The city was occupied. An attempt at a counterattack at Germantown was beaten. And the real major disappointment for a lot of patriots came in November when Washington was unable to hold the Delaware River forts. There were 2 forts, one on each side of the Delaware, that controlled access to the city. With the loss of those forts, the Royal Navy was able to get through to Philadelphia and provision General William Howe's army, which had occupied the city. There was going to be no chance that Washington was going to be able to take it. It was a crushing blow to Patriot morale, and it really brought out Washington's critics in high dudgeon, because there was an alternative. While Washington was having such a difficult time around Philadelphia, Major General Horatio Gates had forced the surrender of an entire British army at Saratoga. Now, Horatio Gates has had a difficult time with historians. His reputation has borne the shadow of his criticisms of Washington, and he was critical of Washington. He lost the Battle of Camden at South Carolina in 1780, from which his military reputation never recovered. We cannot write off Horatio Gates as lightweight. He was not. He was a British veteran who emigrated to America shortly before the Revolution. He had a combat record in the 7 Years' War. He was a military paper pusher. And that's not the sexy part of military history. But this is a man who knew army administration. He knew how to keep records. He knew how to draft orders. He knew how to make sure people got paid. He knew quartermaster and commissary operations. These were skills that most American officers did not have when the Revolution commenced. Washington vastly appreciated Horatio Gates' skills, and he made him adjutant general of the army for the early years of the war. This is the man who took care of military record keeping, drafting orders, making sure that supplies got transferred. It was a skill that was absolutely essential. And when he won the Battle of Saratoga, we have to understand that Horatio Gates was a genuine national hero. There is no question about that, and one can understand why there would be comparisons not flattering to Washington, given Washington's performance in Philadelphia and Gates's in the North. Washington did have its critics, and we should not be surprised. And they were a varied bunch. On top of the listing, or the portraits on the left, on the right of your screen, that's Benjamin Rush. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence from Pennsylvania. Below him is Richard Henry Lee, who actually sponsored the resolution for independence in Congress. Below him is Anthony Wayne, who became a favorite of Washington, but in 1777 was writing letters to Horatio Gates complaining that Washington was losing and officers were getting tired of it. And we have to keep some perspective here, not the perspective of 2020, but the perspective of 1777. Every man in that collage of portraits was a patriot. They didn't want to lose the war. They didn't have any personal animosity against Washington. They simply believed that he was not doing the job for which he was hired. To Anthony Wayne's right is Samuel Adams, one of Washington's most vigorous critics. While he was criticizing Washington, his son was an Army doctor serving in the Continental Army, close to the lines, actually serving heroically in a number of incidents. To the upper right of your screen is another dour-faced individual, Abraham Clark of New Jersey. While he was criticizing Washington, two of his sons were prisoners of war. One of them treated so deplorably that in one of the rare instances, Congress threatened to retaliate unless they lightened up on them, and they would do the same thing to a British officer. In the center on the top is Daniel Broadhead, another officer Washington came to respect. In November of 1777, also writing to Horatio Gates, saying that officers are tired of losing battles. They want to serve under Gates. And Broadhead was openly blaming the losses on Washington's leadership. To the right of the screen, immediately below Abraham Clark, is another major general, Thomas Mifflin. We mentioned him. He was Quartermaster General of the Army early in the war, a Washington aide in high favor with Washington, became disillusioned with Washington's losses. And I could have added other individuals to that collage. So these were serious men, and their arguments were basically on two fronts. You had men like Mifflin, Wayne, and Broadhead, whose arguments were simply military. Washington was losing. This can't be continued if we're going to win the war. Then you had Samuel Adams, Benjamin Rush, Abraham Clark, who simply objected to Washington's insistence on trying to fight the British with the regular army. They wanted to rely on militia. And there was historical context we've got to keep in mind. The military history of the 13 colonies was, in effect, British military history. And as they discussed on the floor of Congress while they're debating what to do about the losing campaign of 1777, congressional critics of Washington noted that during the 7 Years' War, the British government did not hesitate to replace losing generals. After Braddock's defeat at the Monongahela, British Commander-in-Chief after British Commander-in-Chief was relieved of duty when he did not produce military and political results. And they went through a succession of commanders until they hit Jeffrey Amherst, who proved to be a war winner. But it was a rough road for officers who did not win, and Congress was aware of that. And that leads to the question, could Congress or would Congress fire a commander-in-chief? And the answer to that is yes, because they did. We tend to forget that there were two commanders-in-chief during the Revolution. It was Washington, commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and Essex Hopkins, Commodore Essex Hopkins, commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy. Hopkins lost the support of his officers. He lost political support. And in fact, in early 1778, Congress fired him. So the precedent was there. So the question was, would they trade Washington for the more popular Horatio? Two generals in particular certainly would have, Thomas Mifflin and Thomas Conway. You can read Conway's letter. It's a famous letter. And Conway, who was Thomas Conway, I guess is what we need to talk about first. He was an Irish French officer. He was born in Ireland. His parents took him to France at a very young age. He was fluent in English and French. He was a competent officer and came to America, as many French officers did, to dust up their resumes, really, so that they could go back to France and get a promotion in the French army. Conway was a good disciplinarian. He trained his troops well when he entered the Continental Army. He was considered a very good brigadier general, and he was the junior brigadier general. He was not shy about his own abilities. He importuned Congress and Washington for promotion to major general, and it was uh, an episode in Washington's existence that made the general furious. The junior brigadier, he wants to be promoted over all the other brigadiers, and Washington had a great deal of trouble keeping the other brigadiers in line because of this man's influence in Congress. And he had a lot of friends in Congress. He also had a friend in Horatio Gates. After the victory at Saratoga, Conway wrote a letter to Gates praising Gates, and an excerpt of it inadvertently became public. Read it quickly. Heaven has been determined to save your country, where a weak general and bad counselors would have ruined it. Now, we don't know if that's the exact wording of the letter that Conway wrote to Gates. This came to light because one of Gates's aides, James Wilkinson, had too much to drink as he was carrying the dispatch announcing the victory at Saratoga from Gates to Congress. Wilkinson stopped off at the headquarters of General William Alexander, better known as Lord Sterling, a Washington ally, had too much to drink in the evening with several of Lord Sterling's aides, including James Monroe, the future president, who was then a junior officer. And this is what he leaked to those junior officers, who promptly the next day reported it to their commander. Sterling then sent it on to Washington. Washington, of course, was furious. He knew that he was being criticized, but now he could actually put names on who might be involved. He zeroed in on Gates, and he already had contempt for Conway because of Conway's insistence on being promoted. Now, the more important letter, however, did not become public. This one would have been an absolute bombshell if it had. This was Thomas Mifflin also writing to Horatio. You can read it, and the long and short of it is that, as far as Mifflin was concerned, the cause was essentially lost unless Gates came south, took command of the main army, and retrieved the Patriot military situation. In the course of my research on the Cabal book, I found any number of these letters. So this was a general sentiment at the time. Mifflin's was really the first to actually call for a change in command. Well, we've got to ask, was there really a plot? Well, any number of senior Patriot leaders certainly thought so. We can go quickly across the top. There's Henry Lawrence, going left to right, President of the Continental Congress, Daniel Morgan, Alexander Hamilton, who at the time was a close aide on Washington's staff, Lafayette, Benjamin Harrison, a signer of the Declaration of Independence from Virginia, a member of Congress, member of the Board of War, and we will return to him. Nathaniel Greene, John Lawrence, who was the son of Henry Lawrence. So you can imagine the letters those two wrote. We will quote from one of them. Henry Lawrence keeping John, who was also a member of Washington's staff, informed of what was going on in Congress. John keeping his father informed of what the staff was saying around Washington. Henry Knox, Washington's chief of artillery. And of course, Washington himself. All of these men absolutely convinced trouble was brewing for the commander-in-chief. The two key sources I want to focus on here is Henry Lawrence. As president of the Continental Congress, he was better positioned than anyone, really, to keep his finger on the pulse of political opinion in the higher reaches of Patriot leadership. He wrote to his son, John, in early January, and it's pretty clear that he was worried. I hinted some time ago my discovery of party in our councils. The events which I dreaded and in many instances predicted are now coming to maturity. That letter is long, complex, and highly detailed. That's just an excerpt that you're seeing. In it, he makes note that there's no question in his mind that Washington was in deep trouble with Continental Congress. Benjamin Harrison, also writing to another member of Congress, Robert Morris from Pennsylvania, made it very clear that he thought he actually used the word cabal. The cabals, they prey on his constitution, sink his spirits. You can read the rest. Last phrasing is what I want to emphasize. Beware of your board of war. Benjamin Harrison was an original member of the Board of War. And the Board of War was created in mid 1776 to take the routine minutiae of military administration off the back of all of Congress. Congress had been trying to run the war as a committee of the whole. That was impossible. There were too many distractions. Finance, political affairs with 13 states, diplomatic correspondence, Indian affairs. They simply couldn't run the war effectively. The Board of War was created to take care of routine military records, routine correspondence, inventory equipment that wasn't being used, take care of British POWs, to make sure that all of this stuff was taken care of efficiently and that Washington, running a war effort, didn't have to worry about it either. It didn't work. The Board of War was composed of members of Congress, and they ran into the same problems that trying to run the war as Congress as a whole ran into. The president of the Board of War, the first president, was John Adams, who said he never worked so hard in his life while he tried to run the Board of War. So they reorganized it in October of 1777. And what they tried to do was create a board not composed of members of Congress, but of professionals who had experience in military affairs, run the same functions, but on a professional basis and a non-distracted basis. The job of the Board of War would be to focus on these issues, not be worried about anything else that was going on in Congress. Importantly, the board was never intended to get involved with the Army's daily operations. It was supposed to be a support function. This changed with Thomas Mifflin entering the situation. He had fallen out with Washington for reasons that go beyond our ken this afternoon. His relationship with the commander-in-chief had become embittered. Washington was very, very disgruntled with his performance as quartermaster general. But he had a lot of influence in Congress. Mifflin was the chief consultant Congress relied on as they reorganized the Board of War. What we have to deal with is what today is called mission creep. In business, occasionally now they call it scope creep in the management literature. But mission creep actually has a formal definition in the United States military. I'm reading from an Army manual right now. Mission creep occurs when a unit attempts to do more than it is allowed in the current mandate. In other words, mission creep occurs when an organization sets out to do things it originally was never intended to do. Now, it's not necessarily bad. Sometimes an organization will try to do something that makes sense, even though it wasn't necessarily created to handle such and such a task. On the other hand, there's mission creep when an organization tries to aggrandize its own authority at the expense of someone else. In other words, a power grab. And that's what we saw with the Board of War between October of 1777, when it was reorganized, and March of 1778. Let's call this mission creep 1, the Inspector General affair. Washington wanted an officer, an Inspector General, to train the Army, to establish protocol of routine drill, tactical evolutions, officer evaluations. It was an officer that Washington would have had as a direct staff member and a valuable staff member. We remember Friedrich von Steuben as the classic Inspector General, member of Washington staff. But that's not what Washington faced. Thomas Mifflin convinced the Board of War to establish an Inspector General that did not report to Washington. The Inspector General would have reported directly to the Board of War, would not have been a member of Washington's staff, and over that Inspector General, Washington would have had no authority whatsoever. The legislation was very comprehensive. The Inspector General would implement a training regimen for the entire Army, would conduct officer evaluations, make extensive reports on virtually all Army functions directly to the Board of War. Washington had no control over the man. It was, for Washington, he considered it an insult and a threat to his command authority. Worse, Mifflin convinced Congress to promote Thomas Conway to the post of Inspector General and make him a Major General. Washington almost faced a revolt of his other brigadiers. This was Washington's reaction was absolute fury. We know privately he was truly indignant at this whole thing. But taken to its logical conclusion, the Inspector General, as Congress created it, would in effect have been a parallel commander of the Army. If you can devise how the Army is going to be trained and how it will conduct itself tactically in the field, you are responsible for officer evaluations. This is normally what a commander-in-chief would do. This was being taken away from the commander-in-chief, and Washington and his staff knew exactly what it was. One of the best reactions we have to this is that of Alexander Hamilton. And I will read from a letter of Alexander Hamilton to another Washington president. The novelty of the office, meaning the Inspector General, the novelty of the office excited questions about its boundaries. The extent of its operation alarmed the officers of every rank. It makes the Inspector General independent of the Commander-in-Chief, and it confers powers which would produce universal opposition in the Army. The entire scheme is a brat of faction. Hamilton spoke for Washington and its staff when they were absolutely convinced that what they were seeing was a power grab at the expense of Washington's command authority. Gates and Mifflin then set out to take away commissary and quartermaster functions from the commander-in-chief. Gates established a completely separate commissary operation to try and supply food and forage for the Army, but he did it independently of the established commissary department that reported to Washington. And the legislation again said specifically the established commissary department would not interfere with the operation of the commissary agents that Gates put into the field. He called them superintendents. But it created mass confusion. Here you had the standard commissary department, Gates's new superintendents, and because the Army was in Pennsylvania, the commissary agents of the state of Pennsylvania, all competing for the same supplies, driving up prices, creating mass confusion. Less forage and food actually reached the Army at a time when the Army was virtually starving. The quartermaster department, which was supposed to take care of Army movements, take care of purchases outside of food and forage, Mifflin created a plan approved by Congress so that the Quartermaster General would not report directly to Washington. It would be a creature, again, of the Board of War. This is a violation of unity command, which is considered one of the essential principles. So, in addition to the Inspector General affair, you've got the whole issue of logistics and supply being taken away from the Commander-in-Chief. And I can go on and on and on. There's not really time to go into the ways in which the Board of War began to step on Washington's authority. I mean, Gates created new units, moved them around without telling Washington. He took existing units, moved them around without telling Washington. At the Board of War's behest, Conway actually interfered with Washington's attempt to negotiate uh, prisoner operations with the British Army. Again, unity of command was being fractured here as the Board of War attempted step by step to take over control of actual daily operations of the Army. And the final straw, I think, really, let's call it Mission Creep 4, the so-called eruption into Canada. In the midst of the Valley Forge winter, with the Army on the verge of starvation, troops deserting, dying of disease, Horatio Gates decided to launch an independent invasion of Canada. He did not discuss the plan beforehand with Washington. Washington was never included in the planning for the operation. It was to be totally run by the Board of War, independent of Washington. The board began to issue orders directly to Washington's subordinates. It wanted to make Lafayette commander-in-chief of the eruption into Canada, the invasion into Canada. Eruption was the term Congress used. Again, it would be an independent operation, not run through the normal chain of command. Washington at this point had had enough. He stepped in and actually told Lafayette that he did not have to go directly to the North to assume command, that he would be allowed to go to York, where Congress was in session. It was exiled from Philadelphia, and argue about the command arrangements involved in the Northern invasion. Technically, this was insubordination. Washington was not involved in that chain of command. It was supposedly directly from Gates and the Board of War to Lafayette. The reaction to this in the Army itself was explosive. Now, we have two reactions that are really worth considering. One was from the French. Well, his title was not ambassador, but he was the equivalent of the French ambassador. This was André Girard, and he reported directly to the French Foreign Minister, Brigen. His job was to keep Brigen and the French court apprised of what was going on politically in America. He was very close, had his ear close to the ground. His contacts in Congress and outside of Congress were very good. When the word of the eruption became public, Girard immediately got off a letter to Brigen, and he explained it, and I'm quoting from him right now. The entire proposal was, quote, the cabal, or part of, quote, the cabal against Washington. I don't see how it could have been interpreted as anything else. But an even more revealing letter was written by another member of Congress, and this is Joseph Reed, Pennsylvanian. Early in the war, Reed also had served as an aide to Washington, and his relationship with Washington was quite tepid by 1770. In 1776, Washington had inadvertently become aware of correspondence between another American general, Charles Lee, and Joseph Reed, in which it was quite clear Reed had become critical of Washington, had become impressed with Gates. Washington, in the midst of the 1776 crisis, he was retreating across New Jersey, let it go. But his relationship with Reed, who subsequently went back into Pennsylvania politics, never really healed, never developed the warmth it originally had. But when Reed was confronted with the so-called eruption into Canada, he immediately interpreted the whole business as a shot against the commander-in-chief. And he wrote to another Pennsylvanian, and again, I'm reading directly from his letter, to permit power to remain in any hand on which much depends, and at the same time to adopt measures to thwart and enfeeble its exertions, I can never agree to. Either change the hands or support them with your greatest weight. In other words, it's either time to back Washington or get rid of him. Now, Reed announced to all who would listen that it was time to support Washington, no matter what your previous criticisms had been, that the war effort was simply running off the rails in this contest between the Board of War and the Commander in Chief. It was the eruption into Canada that finally crystallized a realization in Congress that they had allowed the Board of War to go too far, and that what was really going on was it was quite legal. It was done publicly, but it really amounted to an administrative coup. One by one, the Board of War was removing the command authority of General Washington. If they had succeeded in all the efforts that they had attempted, Washington, in effect, would have been just another general. The title of commander in chief would have been completely empty. The Board of War would have been running the American war effort. Now, we know, of course, that Washington indeed survived the war as commander in chief, but that does not negate the fact that the attempt to diminish his command authority was quite serious. The Board of War had a great deal of political support. There were even officers who were originally disgruntled with Washington and were willing to go along with the Board of War. In other words, the Conway Cabal, in fact, was real. Remember that collage of people who believed the Conway Cabal or the threat to Washington was real? Were these guys paranoid? It's possible. These were some of the best informed individuals in senior patriot leadership, both in politics and in the military. If anyone had known what was really going on, these were the people who would have known it. And for many generations of historians to really question that, I find quite surprising having reviewed the evidence. They weren't paranoid. They reacted to real events. They reacted strongly to the Inspector General affair. They reacted strongly to the attempt to take commissary and quartermaster operations away from Washington. They reacted with a great deal of mystification, even anger, at an awful lot of the board's various efforts to undermine Washington's authority, and they simply blew up at the eruption into Canada. So we have some conclusions, and we've got to see the cabal as, well, it was really the action of the Board of War, and it was heavily influenced by Washington's critics and the usual suspects, really, as people thought at the time, were Mifflin, Gates, and Thomas Conway. Washington's supporters had seen it from the beginning, and they were right. The board was able to maneuver very freely. Mission creep was quite real between October of 1777 and March of 1778. The board actually, there's no question about it, struck directly at Washington's command authority. The board would have controlled the Continental Army, and the board had political support. Very, very few members of Congress stood up to say, no, we ought not to be doing this. Henry Lawrence was one of the few voices who consistently supported Washington in Congress. And it was really the eruption into Canada that really was the wake-up call that most members of Congress needed in order to back off. So we know that the Conway Cabal ultimately failed. We know that Washington had the political skills and ultimately the political support and military support to deal with his critics. So, how, given what I've said, how did Washington survive? Well, there's an answer to that. Go out and get the book. Here is the book, and it will be available to you in the gift shop of the museum. But if you want the paper on which my notes today are based, there's a 26-page paper, voluminously footnoted, and I'll be happy to mail it to anybody who wants a copy. Please don't hesitate to get in touch. And thank you very much for your attention. I enjoyed myself. I hope you did too, and I will hang around for the questions and answers.
Thank you, Mark. Fascinating. While we're waiting for questions from our viewers to go in, just to reiterate that you can order copies of Mark's book, as well as browse from our other vast collection of Virginia-related items by going to shopvirginiahistory.org. So what we usually ask our authors in these programs who are so deeply engaged in these subjects for a period of time, what's next on your list to research and to publish?
Now engaged in two projects, actually. One, the book is written. It's awaiting publication. I've looked at going back to Horatio Gates in part. As I mentioned, historians have not been actually kind to the man, but he was not the lightweight that a lot of people had supposed. I've looked at the war in the North with a focus on Ticonderoga. It was a period that really, aside from a lot of the bravado of Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, has escaped notice, and it's part of a trilogy. There are three historians involved in this. One looking at the northern frontier in the colonial period. Another one at the early years of the American Revolution. I'm looking at it from 1777 till the end of the war. It was a fascinating period. Northern New York was a vast borderland, really, and involving Canadians, American Indians, Continental Army, militia, the independent state of, or the independent republic, yet a state, and all of that meant for a rather complex military and political situation. That book's done, and working now about halfway through, working with an old friend and co-author, James Kirby Martin. We're looking at violence in the American Revolution. There's been a great deal of attention to that recently, but most of what we've seen published is a description of the violence, and to clear away any doubt, the American Revolution was simply a ghastly mess. It was a horrific war, and what we've had are descriptions of that violence. What Jim and I are trying to do is explain it. That it laps into what has been called existential war, and essentially all the safeguards, what became international law, humanity in war, jus in bello is the Latin term, simply fell apart. And the reasons why, it's pretty grim reading, to tell you the truth. And but we think it's revealing, and we think it's a new take on the war for independence, and one that I think deserves a lot more attention. So it keeps me off the streets and out of trouble. So these projects, historians never really retire. There's always something new. I'm sure your other authors are essentially giving you different versions of that same story.
So the subject of the Conway Cabal is a relatively less known incident in the illustrious life of George Washington. What interested in you in digging in further into this subject?
I mentioned earlier that a friend of mine and I, Gary Wheeler Stone, Gary is an archaeologist, and we teamed up to write a book called Fateful Sunday. And the Battle of Monmouth had always been a fascinating thing. I didn't live all that far from the battlefield, which is one of the best preserved revolutionary battlefields in the country, and some of the best archaeology in the revolutionary period, at least in the military phases of it, has taken place and is taking place. We got into this because I was convinced that the the narrative of the Monmouth campaign was simply misunderstood. That the importance of the battle was not necessarily military; it was a tactical draw. The British got what they wanted out of the battle. They got their army safely back to New York to be redeployed. Washington had the semblance of military performance that he could claim as a victory, which he badly needed after the Cabal experience. And he was bruised. He another losing or even mediocre campaign certainly would have revived his critics. He didn't need that. He needed a political victory. And so the subtitle was The Politics of Battle. And in looking at the politics of the Monmouth campaign, I became convinced that Washington's position was a bit more precarious a lot more precarious than most historians have allowed. And that sent me back to the Conway Cabal. Where did all that criticism come from, and how badly did it hurt the commander? And it also showed that in addition to his military skills, which are a matter of debate among historians, but political skills were absolutely first. Washington, as a commander in chief, knew how to fight politically. He knew how to use individuals on his behalf. He had a first rate staff. Hamilton was part of it. John Lawrence was part of it. His inner circle of junior officers were very, very talented, very, very well connected politically as well. So when it came time to fight back, Washington could organize a defense that was absolutely first. The man was a political master. We generally gets a lot of credit for that, at least among historians. I think the general public has sort of missed that in Washington, but it was the Monmouth campaign that really brought that out. So that's where my interest in the Conway Cabal.
One of our viewers is asking the question, what happened to Horatio Gates after the Cabal ended?
What happened to Horatio Gates? Gates, after the eruption into Canada blew up in his face, was allowed to return to the field. The Board of War was again reorganized under leadership that Washington could deal with. The board never again attempted to become involved in the daily operations of the Army. That was left to Washington. Gates went back to a field command, but never really, they were more administrative commands. He never commanded in battle again until 1780. In fact, he had a chance. Washington wanted Gates, or at least offered Gates the command of what became known as the Sullivan Expedition against the Iroquois in 1779. Gates said, no, that needs a younger man. But in 1780, after the American Army in the South, the Southern Continental Army, was captured almost in toto with the successful British siege of Charleston, South Carolina. Congress sent Gates south to reorganize the Continental Army and try to retrieve the situation in the Carolinas. He committed to battle at Camden, and at the Battle of Camden in 1780, he was absolutely routed. Very controversial defeat. Gates made critical tactical errors. Lord Cornwallis simply drove his army off the battlefield. Gates's reputation never recovered. He wanted a formal hearing to clear his name. He never got it, but Congress ultimately, it took until 1782. They did return him to active duty. And then he became involved in 1783 in what became known as the Newburgh Conspiracy. We don't exactly know what the Newburgh Conspiracy was. It may have been up until including a possible coup by disgruntled Continental officers who were angry with Congress over lack of pay and broken pension promises. Gates was probably at the heart of that. Washington stopped it with a very dramatic performance. He was not invited to a meeting of these officers that Gates and number of his close allies had called. Gates was chairing, and Washington, in effect, crashed the meeting. Went in and very dramatically reminded the officers of what they'd endured, what their legacy was, and frankly, not to disgrace themselves by doing something at the end of the war that would not only disgrace themselves, but call into question the very notion of military subordination, civilian authority. I mean, if that had happened, if the officers had tried something, I don't know what it would have done to the American military tradition. Nothing good. I mean, the tradition in America has always been military subordination to civilian authority. And if right at the beginning of the new republic, the Continental Army had revolted or at least ignored the authority of Congress, it would have been a terrible precedent. And Gates, that all put a further shadow on Gates. Although at the end of his life, he was very close to his wife. When she died, it really broke his heart. He remarried eventually. He married money, so his financial problems were on. He moved to New York. He lost a lot of his old friends. He became a Jeffersonian in his political outlook. So a lot of his New England allies during the war had become Federalists. They walked away from him. He was very, very generous with Continental veterans. I mean, many of these men ended up, even including many officers, ended up quite poor. He would loan money to Continental veterans, knowing he never was going to get it back. He lived as a country gentleman, relatively quiet, never entered politics in any serious way. He never really recovered the reputation he had in 1777. The hero of Saratoga deserved all the praise that he got. I'm not going to get into the argument of whether or not he deserved all the credit he got after Saratoga. I think he deserved more than most historians give him credit for. But his reputation never really recovered. There was always that shadow of intrigues against Washington, terrible loss at Camden, and the Newburgh affair. He was, a genuine founding father, but one who, well, sort of faded, whose star rather faded for the end of, in some ways, a tragic figure.
I think our last question is a very fitting one. One historian to another. You had mentioned early in your talk that over the years, other historians have weighed in on the cabal. Do you know what Douglas Freeman, who was one of Washington's major biographers, had said about this important event?
Sure. Freeman, there was an excerpt of a letter from Thomas Mifflin, which I showed on one of the slides. That was a letter which Douglas Southall Freeman was searching desperately to find. He could never find it. He'd heard about it, but it ended up being misattributed. It was attributed originally to a real firebrand, a radical member of Congress from Massachusetts, James Lovell. It ended up in his papers. It wasn't. It was subsequently identified as being authored by Thomas Mifflin. But whoever wrote it, Freeman was never able to find it. He saw this thing, he saw the whole thing as really a personal affront to Washington. I don't think he saw it in terms of the administrative coup that I've described. He was looking for a flat-out political plot to actually fire Washington rather than to have his authority chipped away measure by measure. But he saw it as something that Washington took great alarm to, at least in terms of Washington's personal feelings. He saw this as a body blow to Washington. That Washington was furious. That Freeman's point was that it made Washington seem very human. at how could anybody endure insults and criticisms like this and not be angry? And Washington was. I think Freeman's main point was that coming out of the cabal, we saw Washington the man rather than this ivory figure up on a pedestal. That answer it?
It does, and there's one more question if we can squeeze it in, which is an intriguing
I'll
one.
be here as long as you want.
What became of the Board of War?
It became what it was supposed to be. It became a support office for the Army. It handled military correspondence to Congress. It kept track of where equipment, not what the actual Army really was. It made sure that the Army had its records maintained more or less in order, that Washington didn't have to handle this kind of routine record keeping. Correspondence from the states, correspondence from anywhere, really private correspondence intended for the Army that really didn't bear on what Washington needed to address immediately was referred to the Board of War. Questions in Congress as to what do we do about such and such a situation could be referred to the Board of War, and the board could decide whether or not it was worth Washington's time. So it was created to be a support office. It was shifted from that under Mifflin and Gates, and it went back to the task for which it had originally been established. And it served through the end of the war and on into the Confederation period. It was the precursor of the Department of War under the constitutional
Right. Well, I think that wraps up our discussion for today. I want to thank Dr. Lender for a fascinating talk. For those of you tuning in, just remember to mark your calendar for our next virtual banner lecture, which will be again at noon on June 4, when Dr. Marcus Nevius will discuss his book, City of Refuge, Freedom and Unfreedom in the Early Republic's Great Ismal Swamp. So thanks again for everyone for watching, and stay safe. Bye-bye.